The stories shared on It Takes Balls are unique to the individual sharing. Always speak with your trusted medical provider for treatment options specific to you. Welcome back to It Takes Balls, presented by Testicular Cancer Awareness Foundation. Today I'm joined by a CEO of the Alloy Market, Brandon Aversano. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me tonight.
So I mentioned you're a CEO, which is, I think, important because we just talked about before we started, like this happens to guys in their primes of their lives. And, you know, here you are in your 30s and you're the CEO of a company, which is awesome.
Thank you.
So let's talk, before we talk about like kind of developing this business that you lead. Let's talk about your diagnosis of testicular cancer. So you were diagnosed at the age of 31. Tell me about like what you saw on your body. What was going on that led you to the doctor?
Yeah, it was actually, so my story is actually a long one. So about 4 years ago, when I was living in South Florida, I was experiencing a lot of pain down there on the right side. And I went to my primary care physician and then ultimately to a urologist who did an ultrasound. And basically what they said was, you're a whiner. So I kind of ignored it, but the pain never really went away. And so I kind of, I was just monitoring it over the years. And then in September of last year, I actually was able to externally perceive tumors, from the outside. And so that's when I kind of knew I had to get plugged back into the healthcare system to get it checked out. So my journey was a little bit longer. And then before I actually was able to perceive the tumors, kind of embarrassingly, but I'm totally happy to share because I do want to normalize it. I actually grew breast tissue on both sides while I was living in Philadelphia, and it was really painful. It was like very tender. And again, my primary care physician at that time kind of dismissed my concerns out of hand. And so it really wasn't until I could literally look a doctor in the eye and say, I feel 2 tumors. This is something serious that I was, taken seriously.
Yeah, that's crazy. So like 4 years ago, you saw the urologist ultrasound. Like, did you ever see like the results of what it said? And what did like the results say?
The results said I had a hydrocell, which I think is just like a small thing of like water that's not necessarily supposed to be there. But basically the report said absolutely no cause for any pain. I mean, it just dismissed me outright, basically.
Jeez. So then when you had felt the tumors or the masses that you felt, like how big were they?
Big enough that as soon as I felt them, I started sobbing. They were big enough. I mean, it felt abnormal. And I would say maybe the size of maybe like an M&M in diameter. But it wasn't like an M&M sized, you know what I mean? But I would probably say that size in diameter.
Okay. Wow. So then for those 4 years, was that something that you were constantly like fearful of? Like, was testicular cancer like on your radar as something that it could have been?
This is going to sound really horrible, but I was basically waiting for the diagnosis, honestly. And it wasn't like I, lived 3 years of my life terrified every day, but I just felt like this is weird. I'm in pain. No doctor is, validating it or really giving me a reason or a diagnosis. And then all those other symptoms kind of started to happen. I started to grow breast tissue and I had horrible night sweats for about a year, like horrible, like I was in a swimming pool. So yeah, I was kind of waiting for the diagnosis ultimately.
And then this came in Pennsylvania when you were finally diagnosed, you said?
No, actually, I was visiting my husband's family in California at the time, and was just about to fall asleep when I performed a self-exam. And that's when I started sobbing in bed. So I actually saw a physician out in California immediately, like in the next 48 hours. And he was able to confirm the diagnosis there. But then I flew back to Pennsylvania where I live and ended up at University of Pennsylvania Hospital for treatment.
Wow. So what was the timeline between like when that doctor diagnosed you in California to your orchiectomy?
4 weeks, almost to the day.
Oh, wow. Okay. So that's kind of like even longer than most guys too, but was that travel related or is it just the scheduling or what?
Scheduling, and I am actually fortunate that I even got that. When I called, they basically said like, "Look, you're looking at 3-4 months before you can get in here. So I would recommend calling around." And I kind of kept calling, and I think maybe the next day or the day after, they actually had a cancellation with Dr. Perazio. So I felt super lucky and grateful, and I took it. So yeah, it was about a month after.
Talk to me about your interactions with Dr. Perazio, because he's like one of the leading guys for testicular cancer. And in his episode that we did, he talked about like the patient provider relationship. So as someone on the other side of that scenario with him, like how was that for you?
He was exceptional in so many ways. I mean, as a 30-year-old, 31-year-old who's, diagnosed with cancer, I was working at the time. So kind of what we were talking about before we started, just like in the prime of my life. And it was one of the first things that he recognized the minute he saw me. He shook my hand and said, "It's so nice to meet you, but I'm so sorry you're here." And it just like set the tone right away. He was inquisitive. He asked great questions. He gave me an opportunity to ask like the embarrassing questions that you don't want to ask everyone else. And then, the one thing I thought, one of the many things that I thought he did so well was he paid attention to my family. And a lot of the other sort of healthcare experiences related to this that I've had, it was very isolating and kind of lonesome. And my family was sort of just ignored. But the journey for them, was equally as, maybe not equally, but separately as challenging and as difficult. And so I was really grateful that he made the effort to also answer their questions and make them feel good and address them. And so he was a consummate professional. He was amazing.
You mentioned your husband, and I know you've mentioned Florida and California and Pennsylvania. So what kind of like familial support did you have because you're from New Jersey, right? Or you're in New Jersey?
I'm originally from Allentown, Pennsylvania, but I've lived in so many places the last decade that I'm kind of all over the place.
So what was like your familial support system like? Were you close to your family as well?
Yeah. So I actually, at the time of diagnosis, I was living in Philadelphia, which was super convenient for doctor's appointments at UPenn. But I ended up actually moving down to the Jersey Shore over the winter of last year to kind of recover, take some disability, make some decisions about what the heck I wanted to do with the rest of my life. And so down the shore, I had my parents, my brother would visit from Philadelphia. And then, of course, my husband and I lived together. And I would not underestimate the power of having a loving, wonderful dog when you go through a treatment journey. My dog was equally as wonderful.
Yeah, just as long as they're not jumping on your...
There you go. Exactly.
Because that's scary too.
Yeah.
So when you got your diagnosis, you did the orchiectomy. What was like the next steps after that for you?
Yeah. So the next steps immediately after that, it was like a really scary time. I was waiting for results. I mean, I'm sure you've kind of heard all this a million times, but it was a really interesting, very reflective period in my life. And then after I had my orchiectomy, and this will kind of naturally segue into what I'm doing now, I tried to sell some gold to pay down my medical bills. I was living in Society Hill in Philadelphia, which is quite close to what they call Jewelers Row, which is just a collection of jewelry stores, pawn shops, cash for gold stores, all that kind of stuff. And so my grandmother had left me some really kind of funky 70s, like gold rings and necklaces that I was never going to wear. And I tried to sell them, and the experience was like absolutely horrific. And so it led me to starting a business, because the one thing I realized was like, look, if I'm having this experience where I am, experiencing medical debt, I'm looking for ways to generate income so I can pay down the debt, and I'm getting screwed by these buyers, like other people are definitely experiencing this too. And so I kind of took a step back and thinking about the rest of my life, having just gotten a cancer diagnosis, considered my own mortality, like I just made the decision to quit my cushy corporate job and start a company called Alloy to really help others who are in the same, frankly, vulnerable position that I was. And so it's been a wild ride since then.
Yeah, you mentioned like the financial hardship, which is not something I think we've talked about a whole lot on this podcast. So
Yeah.
did you like sever from your company, or like, what was that like?
Yeah. So look, even with good healthcare in this country, like cancer is still really expensive. And because my treatment journey split 2 years, my premiums reset like right halfway through. So it was like I had to pay a lot of money to basically hit my deductible and then pay 20% of the rest. You get it. So it was hard. And my husband's a teacher. And so we were living off like very little money in an expensive city. And it was just becoming more and more apparent that like I'm going to have to find ways to generate some income pretty quickly to pay down these bills, because if I don't pay them, they're just going to accrue interest or screw my credit or whatever it might be. So it was a really scary time for us, honestly. And really interesting because the time when I needed the income the most was the time where my income was the most depressed. It was like, when I got sick and had to take disability, that's when I lost my income, which is ironic, but
Yeah, you mentioned like the splitting 2 years. That's interesting. Like, I feel like maybe there should be some kind of thing, and this is kind of a systemic thing, but something where you can kind of set your year from like the diagnosis, that'd be kind of.
yeah, I mean, my surgery was in October. And then, I've had tons of follow-ups and CT scans and all that. And I think every CT scan is something like 12 grand, right? Like that's what the hospital bill says. And so when your deductible resets 30, 60 days after you just paid for surgery and you have to pay for it all over again, it wasn't fun to say the least.
Yeah. So do you remember what your pathology was? Because you're stage 1, right?
Yeah, I was stage 1 seminoma.
Okay. And you're on active surveillance, or did Dr. Parazio like recommend maybe a week of chemo or anything like that?
Yeah, so we had a really long conversation about it, and it was so fascinating. I learned so much about it then, but what I was actually told was basically like, look, you have two options. One, we can do a week of chemo or put you through, a treatment journey. The truth is, and this was what the doctors, it was Dr. Parazio and then a doctor named Dr. Vaughn, who is an oncologist at Penn also. And basically what they said is like, look, the book is written on whether or not you're going to relapse or are already. You either have microscopic cancer cells still inside of you that will eventually recur, or you don't. And so we can do the chemotherapy now as, like a prophylactic measure, or wait. And for me, it was like, if there's not a really high percentage chance that I'm definitely going to relapse, I kind of wanted to just hold on. And so that's the path that we took. And as of last Friday, I had what would that have been? My third post-surgery check-in, and I got my all clear as of last Friday. So we're good for now.
Nice. Congratulations.
Thank you.
So talk to me about like your husband through this, as someone else who has testicles. Like, what is this like for him to see you going through this?
Yeah, sometimes I would make the remark to him that it was probably harder for him than it was for me, because oddly, I still felt kind of in control, right? Like, because it was my body. And even though you're totally out of control to a certain extent when you have cancer, like I still felt like it was happening to me. And so therefore, I had agency over the situation. Whereas my husband, Bobby, he didn't, there was really nothing he could do. And so his only option was just kind of to sit and support. I mean, he was a wonderful support system, but just to like wait and see. And so it was really challenging, really, really challenging for him as well.
Interesting. Okay. And then this is kind of a specific question, just because I know you've talked about your husband too. So like, as someone who, he has testicles and can create sperm, is this like, when they're talking about banking sperm, are they talking about making your sperm, or they're like, no, you're good with his? Like, what is that conversation like?
It was the first or second question I asked Dr. Parazio, honestly, when my husband was sitting next to me, was like, what's the deal with fertility now? And he said that it depends on your treatment journey, that if we end up, this was pre-surgery, if we end up having to do like a chemotherapy course, you definitely want to bank sperm prior to that, because there, is a higher risk of infertility then. So as of right now, we both have sperm banked, my husband and I. So we're hoping for children, but we'll see. They cost a lot of money. So
Yeah. And so what would that look like for you guys? I mean, pardon my ignorance on like the IVF in your
No.
situation, but like, I don't know, does it like a mix or something? Like, how do they do that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So oftentimes what they'll do is they'll actually implant more than one viable embryo into a surrogate at once. And oftentimes more than one embryo will take. So you see that with like, this is going to be such an embarrassing celebrity reference, but Neil Patrick Harris's kids, one of them is his and one of them is his husband's, but they were born at the same time. They're like, so I think the idea is that we'll hopefully both have viable embryos with our sperm, and whatever happens, happens.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
So let's talk more about like the prime of your life thing. So you mentioned like your business, like how soon after your diagnosis and surgery, like you were talking about, you reevaluated your life and you created this company. Like, talk about taking that leap of faith to create this new thing.
Yeah, I mean, wow, it was like as terrifying as being diagnosed with cancer. um, it was really scary. Taking any kind of risk in life is scary, but especially one that puts, you and your family, my husband, in any kind of like financial jeopardy. Like I'm not drawing an income now still. And so it's been a long time. And so it's a big risk, but anyway, yeah, the kind of thinking at the time was like, I've always been really attuned to and really against vulnerable people being taken advantage of. That's always been a huge kind of problem for me. And so when I experienced it myself, it was kind of a no-brainer. And so timing wise, once I took disability from, I actually never went back full time. So once I was diagnosed, took disability, started going through my treatment journey, started racking up the medical bills, and that's when I decided to take the leap.
So I presume that you're on your husband's insurance at this time.
So I am not on payroll, but I do have healthcare through Alloy. That was through my company. That was a big important point for me, obviously, as a cancer survivor.
Yeah, that's something that's scary for me too, because I do own a business on the side as well, like video production, and like I've always kind of wanted to keep a cushy job, as you mentioned it, just for the insurance. But
let me tell you, it's one of the most terrifying parts. I mean, like any startup founder will tell you, it's extremely volatile and nothing is guaranteed. And so, I'm sitting here thinking, wow, if this doesn't work out and I'm not able to like quickly jump back into a job and it's time for my 3-month scans, I'm going to be laden with like a $40,000 to $60,000 hospital bill just for my checkups, So it's definitely something to be mindful of.
Yeah. So let's talk about those checkups. Like, what is, Dr. Parazio got you on now? Like, you looking at 5 years of scans and dropping off every year?
Yeah. So he actually, and I think this is what Penn is kind of doing now, but so after my surgery and working with Dr. Parazio, he transitioned me to Dr. Vaughn for all of my sort of follow-up care. So all of my follow-up scans and appointments now are with him. So I don't get to see Dr. P as much, which is unfortunate because he's awesome. But yeah, so every 3 months right now for the first year, and then years 2 and 3, it's every 6 months. And then it's 1 year thereafter, years 3 through 5. So it'll be 5 years of monitoring pretty closely.
Do you know Alex Walensky?
Wow, that name sounds familiar.
He's a physician's assistant under Dr. Vaughn at Penn, and he had testicular cancer. He was on in November on the podcast.
That's probably why I recognize the name. I probably listened to the podcast.
Yeah, you guys got to connect on the outside, and as testicular cancer survivors.
There you go.
So is there anything else that you wanted to talk about that I didn't ask about?
The one thing that I'll say is that cancer for me was, it was an opportunity to really reevaluate what I was doing and like what track I was following in my life. And it's different for everybody for a variety of reasons, not least of which is like the stage of the disease and all sorts of things. But, I would encourage everyone to kind of look at crises as opportunities for like reflection and change and growth. And out of something so negative and bad, like being diagnosed with testicular cancer, I cannot tell you the number of conversations, phone calls that I've had with customers of Alloy, the company that I started, who say things to me like, thank God I found you. And they are in the exact position I was in. So that kind of like full circle humbling moment has been really awesome. But yeah, that would be my message, is just, really take the opportunity to reconsider and maybe follow a different path.
Do you make have you ever come across a gold testicle?
No, but that's that would be worth a lot of money. So if anybody has any gold testicles they're willing to sell, I will buy one.
Yeah. So any testicular cancer survivors or patients who are listening to this right now, like where can they find you just to talk about your story or to sell you some gold?
Yeah, absolutely. So the website is thealloymarket.com, thealloymarket.com. And we actually have a mobile app too. So it's just Alloy Market in the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store. And we're super proud of what we're doing, and we're doing it, as a result of testicular cancer. So I hope y'all check it out.
Cool. Brandon, thank you so much for being on It Takes Balls.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. It was nice to be here.
For more information and resources for your testicular cancer journey, visit testicularcancerawarenessfoundation.org. You can also follow us on social media at Testis Cancer. We're on Facebook at Testicular Cancer Awareness Foundation.